Is fasting dangerous for muscles? What are the effects of fasting on muscle volume, composition, performance? This is always a topic in the news. What are the effects of physical activity? Can you do physical activity during fasting? Should you supplement in protein? There's a lot of questions about that. I'm Dr. Mesnage, a scientific director of the Buchinger Wilhelmi Clinics, and I am succeeding to Dr. Françoise Wilhelmi de Toledo, who created the research department of this clinic, and I am happy to be here sitting with you to discuss about this topic. When did you hear first about these dangers, so-called dangers of fasting on muscle performance and composition?
I was 17 when I started fasting for the first time. And there I heard nothing about it because it was far away in Austria. And it was a sort of, it was a medically supervised fasting, but very natural, There was no discussion about that. And then after some years, it started because at the beginning, fasting was rediscovered from the medical world to treat extreme obesity. And according to that, they spent months fasting obese people, very morbidly obese people. And then, of course, this question was relevant suddenly, although there is a lot of publication on that time of people having fasted weeks and months without having the least problem. Once they started to supplement the fasting with proteins, and then there was one very big case. 60% died, but they died having a bad protein diet. It was not, it was just collagen.
So they didn't die because of fasting per se. They died because of having a bad fasting protocol, not well tuned, and maybe the supplementation of protein.
Let's speculate, but authorize speculate, because that's my opinion too. Because we didn't see these cases before. And the other thing is that it was sold in supermarkets. So they went out of the hospital where the first fasting for obese persons were done and were at home. So probably the bad supplementation made that it's better to fast without proteins addition than with bad ones. And the second hypothesis is that they just didn't behave normally or good. There were no supervision. Maybe they didn't drink enough. Maybe they took God knows what for supplements finally, but these cases led the medical world to make the conclusion it's dangerous. Fasting can lead to death. I heard that in a congress, Van Italy was a big professor. And I was in the room and I said, no, it's not fasting. It's bad supplemented protein diet.
Yeah, because there is a very big difference between fasting for several months with protein supplementation and fasting for several weeks in a medical supervised environment. And you see that it was for decades still this myth. And that's why you decided to do these studies that you will talk about with me, the Genesis study. And this is to address this myth of body composition and muscles and protein use. Maybe for getting a bit familiar with the term, you can explain also the difference between using proteins and using muscles as a source of energy, because during fasting you burn fat as a source of energy, but is there some amino acids, some muscles which are used for doing energy?
Well, we know exactly the metabolic changes during fasting. So when you stop eating, as long as you have sugar in the blood, you use that sugar as a main fuel. And then the body switches to glycogen. This is a sugar reserve in the liver and in the muscles. And when this is exhausted, then the insulin is down and other hormones are coming. This is growth hormone, protecting muscles, and glucagons. Because glucagon has the task to see that there is always a sort of minimal quantity of sugar in the blood. First, because the brain has difficulties to adapt to the fat burning which other cells in the body, almost all other cells in the body, have no problem. The kidneys have no problem, the muscles, no problems except for the brain. And the brain needs some days to adapt to real fat burning. So it needs a bit of sugar, and you cannot make sugar out of fat. So you have to do it out of some amino acids, some proteins. And of course, you need some proteins for that. And because at the beginning of this time, I'm talking about the 70s, the people said proteins are in the muscles. And they couldn't imagine that you have all the organs that shrink during the fasting giving proteins through autophagy, and these proteins might be good to be eliminated.
Proteins somewhere else in the body, in conjunctive tissues. And when you think about it, it's also long before the 70s, because every animal on the planet is fasting regularly according to season and the rhythms of nature. And like when you have whales going around the world, they use fat as a source of energy, but they move to do their migration. The same for birds. And we have kept this ability of fasting. And it seems a bit crazy that we forget this relation to nature, actually.
Well, I'm totally conform with what you say. It's incredible that one of the most important functions of our body had been conserved through the whole evolution. It's not understood. People don't realize, the researchers don't realize that it's part of our metabolism. And we are very privileged because in our fasting clinics since 100 years, we observe people fasting until 40 days, sometimes 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks or more. And so we see exactly that not only they can walk and make more, but better. Because the muscular performance is not only dependent of the muscle volume, but it's dependent of the circulation, on the function of the mitochondria, on a lot of other elements that are improving during the fasting.
Yeah, this is clear that we can see that daily, the people who come to the clinic and can sometimes start again doing some physical activities. This is completely counterintuitive. This is what made you want to do this Genesis study, right?
Yes, because, we see something every day. You know this little steep place in the clinic where the people at the beginning, they must stop 3-4 times to reach the reception. And then you see them 3 weeks afterwards, they don't make one stop. So you say, okay, this story with proteins doesn't convince me. And we had a lot of protein producers that told us, why don't you give proteins? This would be so much easier. You wouldn't have any reproach. That would be perfect. But I didn't have the impression he was right. I didn't see the point. And now we can say, the protein elimination, selective protein elimination and recycling during the fasting might be one of the therapeutic effects of fasting. So certainly we shouldn't give systematical proteins during a fasting. Certainly not. And probably the people who have sarcopenia, who have too little muscle mass or are very weak, they probably won't be able to do a therapeutical fasting in the clinic.
Yes, there is a limit. We should always remind that. It's clear that you can fast according to your capacity. Sometimes as you age, you switch to a lighter fast. This is what happened with our so-called champion when he decided at the age of 85 to stop fasting and switch to a low-calorie diet. This is really because he knew that it would be a bit more difficult, the metabolic flexibility, and in the end, when you know how to fast, you realize that by yourself and you put yourself in safe condition. But of course, for people who start, we have our doctors to help. But if we get back to this Genesis study, maybe you can tell me about the protocol and how did it start?
Well, it started because two researchers from France, a radiology professor, Pierre Croisy, and a physician, physicien, comme on dit, not a physician, a physicist, specialized in MRI. They came to fast because they had a department also of sport medicine, and they were very interesting to see how fasting was impacting the muscle performance, the sportive performance. And they noticed that was the best improvement they ever had. After 2 or 3 weeks of fasting, he came back home, especially Pierre, and he said he just had the best results all the time. So we start talking, how could we document these effects? And of course, because they are radiologists, they were specialized in MRI, we said, okay, we have to use that. But how, put the people in a full body MRI, it's impossible to pay that for a clinic like we are. And then it was a very complicated story, but we said we have to do that. So we had these 4 times 8 persons in a group who were coming to the MRI and also spectrometry. They made the whole analysis. Then they were brought to the clinic in Überlingen. They fasted according to our method, and then they went back to the MRI. Were put in the MRI again, and after that, we gave them food reintroduction successively, and after 1 month and 4 months, they repeated the examination. So we said, it's the best way, non-invasive, to have results with technologies of today.
Yeah, because I remember that it was not just to look at the muscles volume, but also the functions, and the participants were doing some physical activity first outside of the MRI to do what we call spiroergometry to measure global performance, but also looking when there was some exercise inside the MRI machine to do some sort of virtual biopsies and look even at mitochondrial function. So it was really a very deep study on not just the muscle integrity, but also the function. And I guess this is also something very important to talk about. When we talk about muscles, we tend to focus on size and composition, but we forget the performance. That's really something, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, because many people think, I don't want to lose my muscle, especially the one who have worked hard to have a big muscles. And there is, of course, a loss of volume of the muscle, but a light increase in the performance of the muscle. The loss of volume is reversible. And many of these myths, like the muscle loss myth, was based on the fact that they looked at beginning of the fasting, end of the fasting. No one was looking after the food reintroduction, where everything reverses to the best. And this is what we did. And of course, we saw a loss of volume, but corresponding exactly to the loss of muscle glycogen and the water bound to the glycogen. So that was it. But then in all other parameters, we saw a light improvement of the VO2 max. There was a very good recovery of the muscle after exercise on this mass spectrometry. And there was also an excellent function of mitochondria, in some cases even a regeneration of the mitochondria, which are giving the energy to the muscle.
Yeah, the mitochondrial function was even improved by fasting. And you said something about the food reintroduction, I guess, which is very important. And sometimes you talk about how the food reintroduction is important to rebuild your body, like if it's a house. And that is something we should probably make a highlight on that, because this is very important.
Yes, you're right. This is what we are studying now, the phase of recovery. Like you say, fasting is a sort of huge garbage elimination activation. But when you have shrunk your organs, you have eliminated all the damage, the mutated cells, then you have to rebuild it anew. And this is what Walter Longo calls rejuvenation. You activate stem cells, you have new synthesis. Yvon Lemao, our friend and researchers on penguin fasting, metabolism, he says it's the huge protein synthesis activation in the phase of food reintroduction, like humans have them only in the adolescent time. As an adult, you cannot have this huge activation of protein synthesis except after a fast. So this phase makes a lot of conclusions wrong. Because if you see only at the end of the fasting, you can say, oh, it's terrible. But then the body renews everything, and then you should. And this is why we had the group after 1 month, after the end of the fasting, and 4 months.
I find it incredible that scientific community still doesn't look at the food reintroduction. We have so many collaborators. Sometimes they publish on fasting and they have so many questions just because in the end they just look at one side of the coin. And this is still very common. I hope it will change because it is very important. To summarize the Genesis study, let me know if I forget anything. So the muscle volumes were decreased, but this was normal because of the consumption of glycogen and elimination of water. Then this was completely reversible. There was no damage to the muscles. It was completely intact. And the performance of the muscles was intact, if not increased in some aspect, and this was what we see all every day in the clinic. So this study should really put the final nail in the coffin of this myth of muscle damage by fasting.
Absolutely, yes.
And I think something very important that we didn't touch on is the other aspects which are not medical in this case, because we know that fasting is much more than a physiologic change. It can have effect on your mind, and there's this community and spiritual experience during fasting. And that was really a very big component of the Genesis study, that it will not be described in the scientific paper, but that will stay in the mind of everyone, that I'm sure. Can you tell us a bit more how you live this experience as guiding the groups of fasters in this case?
And we have documented that in a film that is also possible to look at it. And you're right, and I think we both agree, and Franziska Grundler and our other collaborators too, we don't want to be an extractional research. Just take animals or humans and give them a drug and observe them. And we want interaction with them. We want them to have a positive experience for their lives. They give us their data, their blood, their urine, their everything, and we give them the possibility of experiencing their own metabolism. And like you said, and many of them said, without the group, this would have been much more difficult. And there are people saying it's so easy to fast at the clinic because we have this knowledge about what a fasting person needs in terms of human support, of solitude if they want, of nature contact, of dialogues or silence. So there is a mix of all that for us is extremely important. And the other aspect is also that they profit for their health, but also that's a moment where they really maybe have a life-changing experience like our patients. They didn't have a very much different experience than our regular customers, patients, or guests, except they were monitored from. But also that was interesting. You were part of the study. What do you remember as a participant?
Well, it was a very interesting experience because it was for me the beginning of also my role at the clinic. It was just the start. And I remember that even if I knew that fasting does all of this, you're not hungry during fasting, you can do some physical activity. Before you do it yourself, there is an emotional barrier. And I think this is something where it's very common. Probably also many collaborators have done the same experience because it's really when you start fasting yourself that you realize that. And so first, I was really surprised by the effects on my body. It was really interesting to see that I was feeling good, not hungry, and I was doing really a lot of activity.
You had a lot of energy, I think.
Yes, I was really having even too much energy because I think that was maybe the excitement of the experience, plus I was feeling well. So it's really empowering. And that's something which is very interesting for people fasting, is that really it's empowering that you realize what your body can do for you. And it's clear that even for the other aspect, from my experience, the community aspect It was very important. It was really nice also to talk with other participants, understand how they feel. You really feel better as a group. And I think this is really something quite universal to fasting experience. That reminds me about religious fasting experience. It's done often as a group. And even if for this aspect of spirituality, I'm not a religious person, I can say that I have some spiritual aspects of my life, because I think like life is not just dry science. And I think in this experience of the Genesis study, I could really also like think more and take the time to reflect. And probably the fasting metabolism was helping in this regard. So it was really a very, very interesting experience for me to discover what the body can do. And it's clear that when I was doing the physical tests for like efforts, I was really knowing that I would do better when fasting. I was really feeling better, more endurant, and I was not surprised that I had more strength at the end of fasting. The food reintroduction was difficult because it's a moment where like coming in contact with the food and your daily habits is really something difficult. And that's why also I got motivated to then get this study running on the food reintroduction, because I think this is a very, very important
critical moment. Yeah. No, and to come back to the beginning, we did this study because we wanted to eliminate an anxiety people have about the wrong thing, which prevent them sometimes to have an exceptional therapeutical tool. The most extraordinary therapeutical potential in non-pharmacological intervention is the fasting, and especially the long-term fasting. And so saying, okay, don't worry about that, but you have to do a certain program, have a structure in your day and in your fasting period and in the food reintroduction period. And you need especially to be guided. And the best is to have medical guidance. And if you have a sort of scientific accompaniment where you measure all over the places, then of course it gives you a lot of confidence.
Yeah, that was also very interesting. And what I learned also is that in a way, if you switch it around, you realize that fasting and sports are going together wonderfully. And that's why now we are also starting to have new thoughts about new studies where we can design what is a perfect physical activity program with fasting, because in a way it complements each other quite nicely. And I think really there's exciting times coming in the future, because we can really have a personal program for fasting and sport. Yeah.
Yes, because then you might rediscover the joy of doing exercise, and not only I have to do my exercise, and then you can probably have it more easy to do something in your everyday life. Yes, so the best thing to do is to read the Genesis study. Yeah. And if you want to also switch to the film we made, the making of, where we have interviews of the participants and where we show you the setting and the explanation also of our colleagues who made the whole radiological aspect. And they worked very, very hard, because it's 32 persons, 4 times 2.5 hours in the MRI. It was really the biggest study the clinic had ever done.
I don't know if you have any last word, but I think we can thank the participant and also our colleagues, because that was quite a study for everyone, and that was a collective effort, which is now really rewarded by a nice publication.
Exactly.
Thank you for this discussion. I hope it will be very interesting for our audience. See you next time.